Giovanni and I have decided to dedicate this day, a Sunday, to an anniversary, a very special anniversary. On December 7th, 84 years ago at the break of dawn, the air and naval forces of the Japanese Empire launched a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. It was rightly called the Day of Infamy, but it was something very different, something more. A day that no American would ever forget, a day that would change history forever. Today, on the 84th anniversary, we revisit that story through three figures that for once are not human. They are the memories of three ships that never returned from Pearl Harbor. While most of the ships hit that morning were in some way refloated, repaired, and made seaworthy and operational again. From the least damaged of all, the flagship Pennsylvania, to the California, which was completely rebuilt in the following 2 years, three ships never returned. One is still there, the other two were dismantled or in one case even sunk during the transport. These are stories we have selected specifically in memory of that day, and we offer them to you today exceptionally on a Sunday to honor the anniversary on the calendar. Let's go back to the dawn of December 7, 1941. The port of Pearl Harbor, the base of the American Pacific Fleet, awakens in a calm that we could say is deceptive. Think about Ohio Island, with its green, harmonious hills, the water reflecting the sky as if it were a kind of liquid glass, a sort of paradise. And the military personnel, the crews on board the ships, the men of the Army and the Army Air Force were there, ready to enjoy their Sunday, all unaware that a huge Japanese battle group with 6 fleet aircraft carriers and over 300 planes was ready to strike. The Japanese had studied the plan very well. The idea was to secure, by striking at Pearl Harbor, supremacy in the Pacific for 6 to 12 months, maybe even longer, to gain time, to gain an advantage in order to acquire the natural resources that Japan needed, not only to continue the war in China, which began in 1937, but also to establish a total personal and military imperialism, the Pacific area, at the expense, clearly, of the Allied powers in the United States of America. Starting at 7. In the morning, the sky over Pearl Harbor fills with an increasingly powerful buzzing of the airplane engines and then the air raid sirens, the crackling of anti-aircraft fire, the explosions, many ships hit, planes destroyed on the ground, thousands of lives lost. But today we are not talking about those lives. We are talking about three ships that never returned from Pearl Harbor. We are talking about the USS Oklahoma, hull number BB-37, the USS Arizona, hull number BB-39, and the USS Utah, hull number AG-16. These are three different stories, three incredible stories that we will tell you, three destinies intertwined on a single morning that changed the world. Our story begins with the USS Oklahoma. We could call it the upside-down tragedy, one of the proudest battleships in the United States fleet. Launched in 1914 together with her sister ship, the Nevada, she represented a new era for the U.S. Navy. It was a new era inaugurated by the Nevada and the Oklahoma. Thicker armor, more powerful artillery, and, among other things, the only ships with an asymmetric arrangement of the guns, with the second turret super firing at the bow and stern, twin-mounted, even though the one below was triple-mounted. An arrangement also seen in Italy, think of the Doria and Cavour classes, something that, according to some designers, was essentially disharmonious for the firing rhythm and cadence. But in that case, it was still decided to proceed with construction, which was later improved in the following classes, still falling within the so-called standard type. That is, ships that were very similar in design, shape, displacement, and dimensions, capable of always passing through the Panama Canal. The USS Oklahoma had served in World War I and had eagerly escorted in the North Sea, then underwent a long cycle of repairs, modernizations, and exercises. In 1941, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, the USS Oklahoma was anchored next to the Maryland, along what had been called Battleship Row, the avenue of battleships. On that December 7th, the Oklahoma had over 1,300 men on board when the first bombs and torpedoes hit the battleship line. It was one of the first to be targeted. The Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers came in low over the water, dropping their weapons with deadly precision. The weapons had also been modified with wooden fins to allow the torpedoes to travel and strike even in shallow waters, like those at Pearl Harbor. 5 of those torpedoes hit the ship within just a few minutes, from 7:55 to 8 o'clock in the morning, along with other bombs and bullets fired from the Japanese fighter planes' machine guns. She was wounded, deeply wounded, and began to tilt, leaning more and more to one side. In less than 12 minutes, it capsized completely, leaving only the keel emerging from the oily waters. Inside, hundreds of men were trapped. In the following hours and days, rescuers and sailors desperately tried to cut through the armor and the keel with torches and chisels. A witness would later recall that you could hear knocking. You could hear desperate banging on the metal from inside. You could hear the screams, "Help! Save us!" Those screams faded away because inside the ship kept filling with water, and then nothing more. 429 crew members died, including the ship's commander. The fate of these sailors remained uncertain for a long time. Many of the unrecognizable bodies were only partially recovered, and some of them were buried in unmarked graves in the cemetery of Honolulu. After the war, attempts were made to bring the Oklahoma back to the surface. The superstructures were removed, the turrets were cut off, and efforts were made to recover the artillery. In 1943, a massive salvage operation temporarily brought her upright again, one of the boldest technical feats ever undertaken. Moreover, the Oklahoma was not the first ship to sink in port due to a bombing and to capsize. It had already happened at Mers el-Kabir in July 1940. A story we've already told you and that you can find on the channel, but the Oklahoma was just a broken shell. It couldn't be salvaged. It couldn't be repaired and put back into service. It was simply removed from the naval registers and sold for scrap. But while it was being towed to the West Coast, the Oklahoma, or rather what was left of it, ran into a storm. And the tugboats were forced to loosen and then cut the cables so they wouldn't be dragged down into the Pacific along with the wreck. It almost seemed as if the sea had decided to reclaim what the war had already claimed for the ocean floor. Today, where the Oklahoma once lay, there is just a simple bronze plaque bearing its name. There is no grand memorial. But those who know this story understand that it is one of a desperate struggle against fate, a fate that overturns and kills, crushes, drowns. Men who knocked against the metal to snatch one last breath, to stay alive. It's a chilling story, but it's not the only one. Because if the Oklahoma represents the submerged tragedy, the Arizona is the tragedy consumed by fire. Launched in 1915, named after the youngest state at the time in the Union, the Arizona was one of the prides of the American fleet. Over 31,000 tons, its naval might was obvious at a glance. On the morning of the attack on December 7, 1941, the Arizona was still positioned at Pier F7 next to a repair ship, the Vestal. Just over 10 minutes after the start, an 800 Kigu bomb dropped by a dive bomber, an Aichi D-3A penetrated the armored deck, broke through all the bulkheads, and reached the forward magazine. It didn't explode immediately. The fuse takes almost 30 seconds to trigger the explosive, but the explosion is devastating. The explosion is so powerful that it lifts the bow of the Arizona out of the water for a moment and disintegrates the upper deck. The flash of that explosion was seen from miles away, and it wasn't the only consequence, because the Arizona burned for 2 consecutive days. Imagine a wreck that keeps burning even when the rest of the fleet, starting with the Enterprise, returns to port after unsuccessfully hunting the Japanese squadron. Out of the 1,512 men on board, 1,177 died, accounting for more than half of the total casualties in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Among them were Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd and the ship's captain, Franklin Van Valkenburg, who died at their posts, killed by the sudden burst of heat from the explosion. Their families received a posthumous medal, a kind of symbol of dignity that no tragedy could erase. But let's go back to that wreck. When the flames go out, does the Arizona remain where it is? Broken, half submerged, the steel blackened and smoking. But from that ruin, a symbol was born. After the war, as the United States establishes itself as a world power, the wreck of the Arizona becomes a sacred place. In 1962, architect Alfred Price designed a white memorial suspended above the skeleton of the ship, which is still there, submerged, with only the barbette of the forward super-firing turret protruding from the water. The memorial is a light, silent structure. It's a kind of backbone that curves toward the command tower, which is no longer there and then rises back up. Even today, a thin line of fuel oil slowly rises from the wreck. Visitors call it the Tears of the Arizona. It is estimated that tens of thousands of liters still remain in the submerged tanks, which continue to slowly leak into Pearl Harbor Bay. Every year, thousands of people cross that white bridge and look out over the dark water, where the outline of the ship can still be seen. The plaques bear the names of the fallen. Among the few survivors who lived long enough to see the memorial, many chose to be buried there with their companions in underwater chambers lowered among the rusted metal sheets, almost as if to atone for an impossible guilt, the guilt of having survived a hell. The historian Gordian W. Prench, in his monumental A Dawn We Slept, wrote that the Arizona is not just a sunken ship. It is the physical testimony of a lost innocence, of an America that woke up as an adult on a morning of fire. And maybe that's exactly how it is. The wreck of the Arizona is more than a monument. It is an open wound that continues to bleed slowly into the Pacific. But perhaps the most absurd story is the one least remembered. It is the story of the USS Utah, a story that mirrors Pearl Harbor's fate on a smaller scale. A long military life, transformed, erased, and recovered through remembrance. The Utah was another battleship launched in 1909 as part of the Florida class. She had served in the Atlantic. In World War I, participated in fleet operations, received honors for her crew's impeccable discipline, but by the early 1930s, she had become obsolete. And in 1931, she was reclassified as a target ship, a modest second life role, but all in all, a useful one. From Queen of the Fleet to a guinea pig for artillery and aviation tests, her task, if we look at it with today's eyes, was paradoxical. She was supposed to be hit, but not by the Japanese. She had been equipped with radio control systems and reinforced to withstand simulated bombs, serving as a platform for experiments. December 7, 1941. The Utah was also anchored at Pearl Harbor, along the western shore of Ford Island, far from Battleship Row, the avenue of battleships. Its profile, now without its main turrets, was unmistakable. An anonymous area, different from the others. The Japanese knew about the existence of the Utah. They had been instructed not to waste time, torpedoes, bombs, and shells on something that wasn't a target. It was just an anonymous vessel, useless for war purposes, anchored there. Yet, when the Japanese planes arrived, some of the pilots, realizing the mistake, went to attack the Utah because, according to several historians, the Japanese pilots mistook the Utah from above for one of the American aircraft carriers. It was a bit difficult to make, but actually, looking from above and not from the side at the Utah and comparing that profile with the Japanese aircraft carriers, the mistake could have easily been made. Or maybe simply other pilots had decided not to return with torpedoes and bombs still on board and to attack anyway, out of contempt, just so as not to leave anything untouched at Pearl Harbor. The fact is that at 8:01 on December 7, 1941, 2 torpedoes hit the Utah on the port side. The Utah is no longer a battleship and has a reduced crew on board. She also tilts quickly, fills with water, and capsizes in 11 minutes. Of the 525 men on board, 58 die, trapped inside. The stories of the survivors are similar to those of the Oklahoma. Hands banging against the metal sheets, dark corridors, breathing turns into a fearful drumbeat. Will anyone ever come to save us? But unlike the great battleships, the Utah could not be salvaged. The priorities clearly were different. The war required, above all, trying to save what could have a second life useful to the war effort, not a remote-controlled target ship. For this reason, the Utah remained there for a long time, capsized, half submerged on the west side of Ford Island. After the war, divers placed a simple flagpole with a flag in place of the ship, which had been partially razed and dismantled. Because something of the Utah still remains there, there was no great memorial like the Arizona, not even a solemn ceremony, only the sound of the waves beating against the rusted hull. In 1972, a small commemorative platform was built, accessible only to military personnel. It's not a place for tourists. It's an intimate, shaded place where the families of the fallen can leave flowers and silence. Every ship has its own dignity, said an old surviving sailor, even those ships that no longer fight. Today, the Utah, or rather what remains of it, yes, there's still a little left, like an iron turtle covered in algae and coral, the waters have colonized what remains of the wreck. Fish swim among what's there. It's a silent cemetery. It's a natural sanctuary. Among the 3 ships of Pearl Harbor that never returned, the Utah is the one that seems to have found the deepest peace, forgotten by the clamor, but not by the sea. Pearl Harbor is not just a name carved in history books. It's a wound that runs through the American consciousness. It's the starting point of a century of war. After that morning, the morning of December 7, 1941, the United States entered an all-out war that would reshape the world. The echo of that date, as it was defined by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his speech to Congress, is a date which will live in infamy. A date that will live in infamy continues to resonate in the collective memory. Yet beyond the numbers, the voices of the ships and their men remain. The Oklahoma, the Arizona, and the Utah are 3 different ways of dying and 3 different ways of remembering. The Oklahoma is the human tragedy, the bodies trapped, the hands beating against the steel, a collective anguish that no monument can effectively convey. It is the symbol of the impotence of borders. It is chaos of fate turning upside down, just like the ship. The Arizona is the epic tragedy, the explosion, the fire, the martyrdom. It has become the icon of Pearl Harbor on the mangrove, a material representation of national sacrifice. In its wreck lies the metaphor of rebirth, the strength that comes from pain. The Utah is the forgotten tragedy, the oblivion that surrounds what is not spectacular, what is not considered useful. But it is precisely in that silence that a lesson is hidden. Memory is not made only of heroes, but also of what remains on the margins. In the cemetery of the Pacific at Punch Bowl Crater, thousands of sailors rest. The graves with the name unknown continue to be slowly identified thanks to DNA. Among them, many of those who died came from the Oklahoma. In 2015, after years of research, the U.S. Navy announced that it had identified over 300 of those unnamed sailors. The families were finally able to hold funerals and have a place to mourn their loved ones, a place to remember them. Fortunately, time does not erase but restores, and so here we are today. Today, when the Ohio wind rises and moves the surface of the water above what used to be the Arizona, you can see those tears we talked about earlier. Every drop that rises from the wreck is a chord, a memory that resurfaces. And yet Pearl Harbor is not just a place of mourning, it is also a sign of continuity, because new generations of U.S. sailors go there for training visits. Many board the mighty Mo, the USS Missouri, which we've already dedicated a video to. You can find it on the channel. And then they go to touch nearby the white marble of the Arizona Memorial, and they read the engraved names. Some even ask to be taken to the platform above what remains of the Utah, where that solitary flag waves in the wind. Everyone understands that those ships don't just belong to military history, but to the fabric of American memory. In the diary of a young sailor who survived the Oklahoma, found many years later, there are 2 very beautiful sentences written. I don't know why I'm alive. Maybe because someone had to tell what happened. So, telling what we do, even ourselves within history, is all that remains. It's all that matters. Telling about the ships that sank and the lives that try to stay afloat. And telling how the sea, which swallows and preserves, can become an archive of memory more lasting than the iron of the ships themselves. And as time goes by, Oklahoma, Arizona, and Utah continue to exist in the depths of the ocean and in the collective consciousness. They are not just wrecks. They are names submerged by history, voices that silence has not been able to extinguish. As the poet Carl Sandburg wrote, the sea is as ancient as time, but every wave knows how to cry out new names. And so every December 7th, when the sirens sound at dawn and the flags are lowered to half-mast, those names, Oklahoma, Arizona, Utah, resurface, suspended between memory and the sea, between history and legend?